Imagine two criminals, Alice and Bob, who have been caught for a serious crime. They're placed in separate cells and are interrogated by the police. They're both given the same choice: betray the other and testify against them, or stay silent and cooperate. Here's where it gets interesting. Their choices will determine the length of their sentences. If both stay silent, they'll both get a moderate sentence, 1 year each. If Alice betrays Bob and Bob stays silent, Alice goes free and Bob gets 5 years. The same applies vice versa. But if they both betray each other, they both get 3 years. Each prisoner is making this decision in isolation. They don't know what the other will do. The dilemma is that despite both choosing betrayal leading to a worse outcome for both, the rational choice for each individual is to betray. Now, you might be wondering, why does this happen? Why is betraying the rational choice, even if it leads to a worse outcome for both? Well, that's the paradox. The individual's incentive to betray comes from the fear of being betrayed themselves. It's a clear example of how self-interest can lead to a less optimal outcome for everyone involved. However, what if this adversarial game was played multiple times? Imagine two rival companies, Alpha Tech and Beta Corp, operating in the same industry. Each quarter, they face a decision: cooperate, keep prices high, and avoid a price war. They could either defect, lower prices to capture more market share. If both cooperate, they each earn $10 million. If one defects while the other cooperates, the defector earns $15 million and the cooperator earns $5 million. If both defect, they each earn $6 million. In the first quarter, both companies defect, fearing that the other might exploit their cooperation. They each earn $6 million, a suboptimal outcome compared to mutual cooperation. Over time, both companies realize that mutual cooperation yields better long-term profits compared to constant defection. By fostering trust through repeated interactions, they avoid the destructive price wars that would arise from defection. Although individual self-interest might dominate in one-off scenarios, repeated interactions can lead to cooperation, trust, and mutually beneficial outcomes. It's a powerful example of how relationships, communication, and strategy shape long-term behavior in both human and organizational dynamics. So, to test this out, in the 1980s, political scientist Robert Axelrod decided to hold a competition. He invited scientists, mathematicians, and game theorists from around the world to submit strategies for playing the prisoner's dilemma. These strategies would compete in a computer tournament where they played against each other in what's called the Iterated prisoner's dilemma, a version of the game played repeatedly. Strategies would face every other strategy multiple times, and points were awarded based on following outcomes. If they both cooperated, they both got 3 points each. If they both defected, they got 1 point each. And if one cooperates and the other defects, the cooperator gets 0 points and the defector gets 5 points. Axelrod received 14 submissions. Some strategies were incredibly complex, relying only on predicting opponents' behavior. Others were simple and reactive. For example, you have strategies such as always defect, which was to always betray the opponent. You also had always cooperate, which strategized by always cooperating no matter what. You also had a random strategy, which would randomly choose to either cooperate or defect. And you also had a strategy called tit for tat, which started with cooperation, then simply copied the opponent's previous move. The tournament played out, and interestingly enough, the winner was tit for tat. It's a surprisingly simple strategy. It starts off with cooperation and just mirrors whatever the opponent did in the previous round. If they both cooperated, you cooperate. If they defected, you defect back. In Axelrod's words, tit for tat was a nice, yet retaliatory, forgiving, and clear algorithm. So, why did tit for tat outperform the other strategies? Axelrod states out a few key reasons why. First off, the tit for tat algorithm is nice. It never defects first, and this allows to encourage cooperation. Second, it's retaliatory. If the opponent defects, tit for tat punishes them immediately, and this helps prevent exploitation. It's forgiving. If the opponent goes back to cooperating, tit for tat forgives and cooperates as well. And finally, simplicity. It's easy to understand and predict, which builds trust over time. Axelrod's tournament taught us a powerful lesson. Cooperation can emerge naturally even in competitive environments when strategies like tit for tat are at play. This has real-world applications everywhere, in business negotiations, international diplomacy, and even in nature. Animals and organisms cooperate when it benefits their survival. Robert Axelrod's experiment changed how we understand cooperation and competition. It showed us that strategies based on trust, fairness, and reciprocity can thrive, even in a world where self-interest often rules. And the best part? Tit for tat isn't just a strategy for game theory, it's a lesson we can use in life. Start with trust, reward cooperation, and respond to exploitation fairly but firmly. Using this insight, let's see if we can simulate the iterated prisoner's dilemma using genetic algorithms. Suppose this situation. Let's say we have two people, Alice and Bob. If both cooperate, they get 3 points each. If Alice cooperates and Bob defects, Alice gets 0 points and Bob gets 5 points. Conversely, if Alice defects while Bob cooperates, Alice gets 5 points while Bob gets 0 points. Finally, if Alice and Bob both defect, they get 1 point each. Both players are trying to maximize their points. But what if there were hundreds of people playing the prisoner's dilemma together? To simulate this, I decided to create a species called Bibbles. Bibbles are simple creatures. These bots will compete with one another, rack up points, and reproduce. After a few iterations, ideally, the bots that adjust best to the given environment will survive. And as Axelrod mentioned, bots that are kind but retaliatory have a higher chance of survival than other bots. In order to create an algorithm that could dynamically adjust to the given environment, I attributed 4 personality traits to the Bibbles to help them dictate making decisions. The first is how agreeable the Bibble is. In other words, it measures how nice it is. It measures the likelihood of it cooperating after both cooperate. Next is forgiveness. It measures the probability of the bot to cooperate after being betrayed. Next is how apologetic the bot is. It measures the probability of the bot to cooperate after betraying the other bot. Lastly is how easygoing the bot is. It measures the likelihood of the bot to cooperate after both defect each other. Using such personality traits, we can create an algorithm that could adaptively react to dynamic situations in various playstyles. Another important factor is how much weight Bibbles put emphasis on previous events. It's sort of like an availability heuristic. If the bot puts more emphasis on more recent events, it will make decisions based more on near events. If the bot puts emphasis more on old events, it will make decisions based more on previous events. This in turn can be used to calculate the impression the bot has of its opponent in a given situation. The impression score is the probability that the opponent bot will defect or cooperate from the eyes of the bot. So if the score is closer to 0, the bot determines that the opponent will defect. And if the score is closer to 1, the bot determines that the opponent is likely to cooperate. Using this calculated impression score, we can dictate which move the bot will play next. Currently, the bot is unsure which move the opponent will make, leaning a little bit more towards as believing the opponent will cooperate as the impression score is at 0.506. We can take the geometric mean between the impression score and the agreeable score, the mean between the forgiving score and the impression score, and so on and so forth. After this, we can use these scores to figure out which move is best to take in a given situation. As you can see, although the bot initially thought the player would cooperate, it ends up betraying because of the personality traits that it had, ending up with a final impression score of 0.46, ultimately defecting. These processes are computed multiple times between the population. Each Bibble competes with every other Bibble in the population, and the Bibble who has the most amount of points at the final round wins the tournament. When the population war is over, the top 10 species will be selected to survive to be in the next generation. The remaining 90% of species are created by reproduction. The Bibbles with higher scores get a higher chance of reproducing with one another, and the resulting child competes in the next generation. Mutations are also included to create variance within data. So, the final species comprises of the top 10% of species from the previous generation, and the rest are comprised of children resulting from the reproduction process. Let's see how the bots perform. As you can notice, in the first round of competition, the bots who cooperated more had a trend to gain a higher fitness score at the end of the day. At Generation 5, you can see that these strategies start to converge into clusters. The clusters get closer and closer, and the population becomes comprised of more like-minded and cooperative bots. And at the end of the competition, the bots have all converged towards a single point. In game theory, this is also called the Nash equilibrium, a converging point that may possibly contain the most optimal strategy in a game of the iterative prisoner's dilemma or any game regarding game theory. And here are the results. The bots have been ranked from best to worst. As you can see, the fitness scores, the scores resulting from the competition, they all seem to be equal to one another, signaling that the bots have all been receiving the same score, cooperating with one another. It's also important to note that the bots have performed the best show to have the highest trustworthiness scores. If we grab two random bots and compete them with one another, sure enough, we can see that the bots have started to cooperate more with one another. The final competition shows all ones. The bots have consistently cooperated with one another. In order to see how these bots actually function, let's play against one of the bots to see what happens. Alright, let's run the simulation. Let's see what happens. I can choose either 1 to cooperate or 0 to defect. In the first situation, I think it's wise to cooperate. Let's see what happens. And as soon as I press 1, I can see that the bot cooperated and the player cooperated. From this, I can see that the impression score of the bot is 0.51, so the bot will cooperate next. Let's just pretend we don't see the score and keep on continuing with the game. Let's say I defect next round. Then the bot cooperates next round and I defect. From this, we can see that the bot is likely to defect next round. If I press 1, then the bot defects and I cooperate. Let's say I'm forgiving. I want to cooperate again. Then I can keep on going in the cycle of cooperation, and let's say I get sneaky and I defect somewhere in the middle. Then the bot is likely to defect in that given situation. If I defect again, and the game ends. The interesting thing is, although in individual situations, my score may be higher than the bot score, in a scenario where there are hundreds of bots with hundreds of competitions, the overall total score of the final bot will be ultimately higher than the one that I currently have. So in a way, Axelrod was correct. Tit for tat is indeed the best strategy to take in this situation. You have to be kind and cooperative, but know when to set your boundaries and retaliate. Overall, I learned a lot making this project. Thank you so much for tuning in. Have a good day.